Thanks. Start with a few thanks. Thanks to Vicki for that introduction. Thanks to the association for bringing me back. And thanks to all of you for being here this morning after a big night last night. And I also wanted to thank Sir Worsley for that introduction. And I was really pleased to hear of all these initiatives that are going on a national level, and especially that you didn't only talk about planting trees, which for this group I think was really good in your message. Because planting them's easy, but having them grow to large trees is a bigger challenge. And coming from Canada, where we have no federal support, no provincial support for urban forestry at all, and where urban forestry lies in individuals and municipalities, it's really, I'm always jealous when I hear these things. So, as Vicki said today, I'm going to talk a little bit about pruning, and title of my talk is Reduce the Crown and Retain the Tree. And just, I always like to give a quick introduction. I like to say I've been hanging around trees since I was a little kid. And I took that passion for climbing trees to climbing rocks. And lo and behold, when I was doing my undergraduate degree in arborists, came to our backyard. And the next day, I became an arborist because they were going to pay me to climb trees. It was amazing. And that was sort of the path to where I am today, and it's actually, you know, a lot of times I talk about urban forestry and get involved in that, but pruning trees and working with trees is still a real passion of mine, so I'm happy to speak today on this topic. And I just wanted to take a quick moment to give a recognition to two people in the room who have been highly influential in my knowledge, especially with old trees and all things trees, and they're here today, so I'd like to thank Neville Fay for his mentorship and his friendship, and also Ted Green, who's been a real champion for trees and has been so generous in sharing his knowledge and coming to Canada and trying to influence our environment. So thank you to both of them. I'm going to, just a quick outline of what I'd like to try and do in these next 40 minutes. Thought I had an hour, then Simon told me, no, you don't have an hour. So forgive me if I go fast. I'm going to try and get through it to the end. But I'm going to look, you know, just a quick look back at where some of the influences on my thoughts on reduction pruning come from. So a little bit about the old trees and natural processes. And then look at how crown reduction can help to reduce risk, enable us to conserve trees. And then actually most of it is I'm going to try to keep the text to a minimum and just go through some scenarios, some case studies, to show some examples of where I've used reduction pruning with my colleagues in Canada. And as I've been, you know, looking at this topic, I've been very lucky to have some of my colleagues in different places send me other examples. And a wide range of scenarios where reduction pruning, I think, really does come into play, and hopefully show some effective approaches. So I like to start with this. I'm not going to go through it, and like most people say when they show this, I hope that everybody in the room recognizes the benefits of the urban forest. And you know, I like to say the urban forest is where the people live, and if we want to influence people about our passion for trees and forests, we've got to help them where they live. And I worked extensively with my colleague, Dr. Andy Kenny, in Toronto, which Cecil referenced earlier. And we developed this graphic a long time ago just to try and emphasize that if we have a city full of trees, and we've talked about canopy cover and canopy cover studies, well, if you look down on a city and it was full of these trees, you'd think, well, we're doing pretty good. We have green everywhere. But actually, it's the large stature trees with the large canopy volumes which give these exponential more of these benefits that we all want to derive from these trees. So the thrust of my talk and of using this graphic today is that my experience is that we've fallen behind, and where we are right now is we're losing these trees, and we're not doing well enough in getting these ones coming back up. So my focus on reduce the crown, retain the tree is let's try and keep more of these older trees, bigger trees where we can while we catch up and fill in that canopy volume that's so well needed in our urban environments. And my focus today is mostly on urban trees, despite my passion for those ancient trees in the forests. We just don't have too many of those. So quick, review back on heritage trees and conservation arboriculture. And Neville put this together with some of his colleagues, and I'm sure you're all aware of it. But from this, we understand that trees, as they age and get into those later stages, they naturally start to get smaller. And two terms which I've come to learn over the years, and these are just my definitions, but retrenchment is the first one. And it's a natural survival process for trees. Trees are amazing. They can survive for a long time. And retrenchment is, as Ted has said, old trees must get smaller. If they're going to survive, they need to get smaller. And I'm in Britain, so I think you all understand that aspect of it. And the other part is reiteration, and that when those trees get smaller, they have this amazing ability of reinventing themselves as a lower, smaller self. And it's a survival strategy. So these, the future tree is this growth lower down in the canopy. And, from this, maybe we can learn that we can learn from nature and try to mimic that in some of our practices where it's appropriate. And, there was some discussion yesterday about retrenchment and how it's used and where it's going. And I just think one thing which I think didn't maybe come across, or I'd just like to say, is that my understanding of retrenchment pruning is that it's not for risk abatement, it's not to save the whole tree. The purpose of retrenchment pruning is to help stimulate the lower crown. And so the first pruning in a retrenchment pruning is to take a small bit from the outside of the canopy to try and initiate a lower crown. And in fact, the second round in a retrenchment pruning program is actually not to go back and then take a bunch more. It's actually to go back, and because most times when you prune on the periphery of the canopy, you will get a proliferation of new growth. You actually have to go back the next time and thin that new growth to allow that light to keep penetrating while you start to develop that lower crown. And that's what retrenchment is. When we start to take bigger parts off, I think that's moving away from retrenchment, and it's necessary sometimes for risk reduction and to keep our trees from falling apart. And so I've had the chance to experiment a little bit here and there with retrenchment pruning. And as I mentioned before, we unfortunately don't have many old and ancient trees, but I work with a lot of nice trees, and this is one in the city of Toronto. And it was one that we actually did a tree pulling test on, because it's got a driveway right beside it there, and in the past they lopped off all the roots and it's got some decay. And when we did the pulling test, this tree was on the margins, but it wasn't a really drastically reduced safety. So I prescribed what I felt was a retrenchment pruning approach, and the contractor who I work with went and just did a little bit of pruning around the outside. And this was really one of the first times that I experimented with this. And then this tree's quite far from where I live, and one day my colleague Larry called me up and he said, "Philip, the client's called back. You said that we should come back in 5 years and revisit the tree and see whether it requires any more testing." He said, "You've got to go back and look at that tree." He said, "It's amazing what's happened." And so you can see here, when we first looked at the tree, it was pretty thinning canopy, not very dense. You can see right through it. And 4 years later, this is what the canopy looked like. It's really invigorated the canopy. There's a lot more denser growth. And I think that this is sort of the proof positive for me, because as I mentioned before, I had lots of slides and learning here and from Neville and Ted, but this is one of the experiments that I've done with it and seen some really good results, that this just minor pruning on the periphery of the canopy can have the effect of invigorating the tree and starting that, filling in that lower canopy. So I thought I'd try and show that slide rather than my series of slides that I've been showing for years from Nev and Ted, because most of my conservation arboriculture lectures are given in North America, where I've got a very steep path to try and convince people of these types of ideas. The other place where I've learned about the effect of crown reduction is in the realm of static tree pulling tests. And I've been working with the folks from Germany since 2001 in this area. I started reading about it in the late 90s, and I embraced the approach. And a tree pulling test, for those who haven't seen it before, just quickly, we have a tree which has an issue. The development happened and all the roots were cut on one side, and then they were worried about the tree falling on the houses. So we place an anchor up in the canopy of the tree. We have an anchor on the ground. We didn't pull with this vehicle. We used it as a weight. And then we lightly pull on the tree, and we can measure its propensity for uprooting or for breaking using some instrumentation. Here we just another graphic of it. We have a pulling mechanism, a winch. We measure the force. We can measure inclination at the base, and we can also measure the strain of the fibers in compression or tension. And you've got to pull hard. This was me on the winch. I got to do the pulling while my younger colleagues who are more adept at the computer were working away. But from that, what I've learned is that because when we do these types of tests, we also run a computer analysis, and we model the crown, and we can model in the software, we can model crown reductions and see what their effect is. And what I've learned is that oftentimes a very small amount of reduction on the periphery of the canopy at the top of the tree or on the outsides can have a significant increase in the safety factors for the tree. So this is one of the examples, one of my day-to-day examples with this. So who in the room, if they came up to this tree, would start to think about felling it? Anybody? Wow, that's great. You would. Excellent. One person's brave enough to say so. Oh, there's another one. And I think I asked that question. I'm glad to see not that many people put up their hand. In most crowds, I would see more. But I was brought to this tree because it's got a proliferation of fungi at the base, and they actually asked me to do tomography on this tree. And when I came to look at it, I said, well, we could do a tomograph, but I think we're more concerned about whether this tree might fall over with a proliferation of a root-rotting fungi. So we did a pull test, and here's the canopy before we tested it, and we used this sort of outline of the canopy for doing our analysis. And the controversy about this tree, the city the inspector put a big X on it, and then everybody on this street went crazy because they love this tree. And also where we are in Canada, we have emerald ash borer. So you can see in the background here, there's an ash tree that's already dead. There's another one standing there. And so on a street that's losing half of its trees for sure, they're really upset to see their beautiful oak going. So this was the kind of scenario where we get asked to bring in a further assessment. We don't do it every day. But when we were done, we modeled that in order to keep the tree there, we would need to do this sort of reduction. And just to be clear, we didn't actually ask for this part of the canopy to be taken away because it's the lower canopy, and we would have actually liked them to keep more of it. But this was the type of crown reduction that was required in order to retain the tree. And that's what it looked like from another angle. And we did this job 7 years ago, and the tree is still there, and it's still looking good. And actually, surprisingly, I've never seen the fungi come back out at the base of the tree. Not to say they went away, but we've been able to retain this tree for quite a period of time. And actually, I got a request a few days ago for us to go back and test it again. So we'll see whether it's still, the roots are still there, the canopy's still looking well. So, the community was certainly really happy to be able to keep this tree for a little while longer. And just one other scenario. This was a job where I got asked to do an arborist report for this site. And I think you're experiencing the same thing here, where people are on a lot which had a small house, modest house with beautiful trees. Now they want a monster house out to the edges of the property. And our protection policies are not as rigorous as yours, and we see these trees going missing. But on top of that, 8,000 square foot house, they also wanted a garage with a basement. And so I said, well, I looked at the plans as you do as an arborist in a preservation plan, and I said, you either need to move this foundation 3 meters away from these trees, or you're going to have to remove them. And this row of trees is actually in, some form of heritage trees. It's an old hedgerow that was a windbreak on the farmland. And as this town was developed, they actually made the road structure so that these trees could line the backyards between two properties. So then fast forward, I submitted a report. It got through the planning process, and lo and behold, I got a call, and this is what I found. They didn't move 3 meters away, and they didn't take out the trees. And so, I think most of us in the room would probably have a pretty good gut feeling about what this means for the trees. But, at this point, the homeowner was, I love these trees. We have to try and keep these trees. A little late. And I would also say the planning process really failed because in, pretty clear English, I said there's one choice or another, and whoever reviewed this put it through anyway. So the blame wasn't only on the people that did this work, it's also on the planning process that enabled it. In any case, because we do polling tests, I said, well, if you really want to try and keep them and want to know if it's possible, we'll do a polling test. And I climbed these trees myself on a Tuesday, and I worked on the weekend to run the analysis, and on Monday I called the folks to give them the results that they should probably remove 2 of the trees. And they said, well, Philip, you remember the storm on Friday? Well, this is what happened. They reduced themselves completely. And the trees not only fell over, they fell back onto the neighbor's property. So this was a bit of a mess. And I was very thankful that I never got involved in any of the legal schmozzle that happened after this because, quite frankly, they didn't want me there because my report said don't do this. So just another experience with, reduction won't help in every scenario. I certainly, the silver lining of this for me is that there were 3 trees, and I said, these 2 definitely had to go, and this one could probably stay. These ones fell over, and that one didn't. So it was kind of reassuring about our method, at least, but not so reassuring for the folks who live there. So those are a couple of the areas of influence in my thoughts about crown reduction. And really, the rest of the talk, I just want to run through some scenarios, some case studies that I've worked on to show you where we've applied this. And, I think it's clear by now that my thoughts are that we can reduce trees, and sometimes we have to, or we can, and without, doubting ourselves or having too much wringing of hands, because we're trying to preserve these trees for the benefits that we accrue from them. So some of the thoughts that I have about this is that, yesterday we had, our thought leader, Ed Gilman, talking about corrective or structural or formative pruning, and it's certainly an option, or I wouldn't even say an option, it's an imperative for our young trees. But when we get to mature or more complex trees, we can't oftentimes correct them, but what we can do is try and improve them from where they are to a better place so that we can keep them around for a bit longer. And if we do this correctly, because in most cases reductions aren't a one-time event, as Henry said about bleaching, once you start it, you have to keep going back. And I think in many cases it's the same with reductions. It's a process, it's not a one-time deal. So if it's done correctly, each time you apply, we hope that we're compounding the improvement on the tree that we're working with. And a couple of other thoughts, maybe the challenges of this, and I think this really is, everyone in the room would understand that, it's what is the pruning dose? What's the correct one? How do we figure out how much or how little to take off? And, shy of doing advanced and sophisticated assessments, which most of us aren't going to apply, and I certainly don't apply to every tree, we have to make some decisions. And, if we make really large cuts, we can compromise the aesthetics of the tree, which to me is less important in many scenarios, but we are going to affect the structure, and as we heard from some of the speakers yesterday, we could be affecting the function. And with that, the function aspect, and I definitely understand that we can affect the function, but once again, in some of these scenarios, if we're not doing some of these things, someone's just going to go and take the whole tree. So, a tree with some impaired function and a reduced lifespan is better than no tree at all in many of these scenarios. And but large cuts can often be really helpful and necessary for short-term risk reduction. We've got, like when we look at, for example, the lapsed pollards, and they've grown these massive parts on a hollow stem. If we really want to keep it there, sometimes we've just got to make that bigger cut. And then small cuts, which I encourage, in some cases may not have enough impact. How do we know? So, I'm not going to say I have the crystal ball, but I've developed some ideas, and that's what I'm trying to share. The one thing I do know is that if we reduce the leverage, generally we're going to have some effect on reducing the likelihood of failure. If I have a bunch of weight on my arm out here, it pulls down on my shoulder, but if I put that same bit of weight right there, I don't even feel it. So that leverage, pulling the weight in closer, has an effect of reducing the strain on the whole tree or the strain on the branch. So this is the first case study or example that I want to share. And this is white pine, Pinus strobus, an iconic tree in Ontario. We're on the border of the Carolinian and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest, and this is a major component of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest. And regrettably, when our British forefathers came to Canada, they took away a lot of these trees to make masts for their ships. And we had actually beautiful whole forests, the pineries, full of these iconic trees. So I have a particularly fondness of these trees. This one you can see has two stems. And we heard some discussion around codominance, and we understand that those two stems can move apart. Unfortunately, we do have unscrupulous contractors among us, among our brethren. And when I came to the scene, two people had come, told these people, well, this tree, because it's two stems, you've got to remove it. And of course, they gave them a big price. And they were kind of crestfallen, and they got a hold of me. And I looked at it and I said, well, I don't think there wasn't included bark. There wasn't any sign of cracking. And it's a beautiful tree, and they didn't want to lose it. So we looked here, instead of removal, we looked at, we couldn't, as Ed might say, for a younger tree, we couldn't subordinate one of them to make it better. So we had to work with what we had. So we looked at some reduction pruning. And so here we have the tree before, and here we have the tree after. And you can see that mostly in the upper canopy, and in some other places, we thinned out and reduced things. And really the purpose of this was to, this tree grows in a forested neighborhood. And my objective was to try and reduce the height of the tree a bit, perhaps enough that it sits below the rest of the forest around it, so the wind could pass over it, and that leverage force, a little bit of wind on the top of the tree creates a lot of sway, and try and avoid that. So the top was thinned and reduced, and we brought the height down below the surrounding trees, and that's looking up into the canopy before, and that's then looking at it after. And you can just see, I know that the light changed, but hopefully you can see a slightly thinned out and reduced crown. And we also added a couple of dynamic cables to this tree. And it is in the neighborhood where I live, and I go walking with my dog every day, and I see this tree, and it's again 7 or 8 years later, and it's still there. And what I'm really happy about is that the conifer really didn't sprout a whole bunch of new growth. The pruning dose, I think, that my colleague Ryan applied was fairly appropriate, because it didn't cause a massive proliferation, and we haven't had to go back to this one yet. This is another example, and yeah, I just mentioned my colleague Ryan Redvers. When I originally started giving this talk, I asked him to join me because I did a little bit more on the sort of the technical side of things, but I also wanted to have a practicing arborist along to give his perspective. And Ryan is a young guy in Ontario, and I never taught him any of this stuff. He just started to come to it himself. So this is one of his examples. It's a poplar tree. It grows between two properties. And I think many of us have experienced issues with trees that have two owners or two people on either side. And this was one of those. Ryan's client loved the tree, the benefits, the shade, all of those things that it was providing. The neighbors on the other side hated it. They hated the fact that it dropped leaves, that it filled their gutters, etc. So Ryan was able to convince everybody that, we're going to try and keep this tree somewhat under control. We don't want to lose it. We want to keep everybody happy. So he did a crown reduction. And so we started with, this is the outline of the canopy. And when he was done, it looked like this. So he brought it back just a little bit, thinned it out. And the point of this reduction, and again, I mentioned that oftentimes these treatments have to be repeated. We all know that a poplar is a pretty fast-growing tree and will start again. And so it'll have to be repeated. But it was a solution that both sides could live with. So we managed to retain this tree in the face of actually it being removed. And Ryan, as I said, is pretty switched on and likes to look at, analyze things. So with this pruning, a lot of times when he does this stuff, he actually starts counting every piece and measuring it. And he had 36 6 to 7 foot pieces between 3/4 of an inch and 1 1/8 inch diameter. So, no really big cuts, mostly things around the outside, and not a big impact on the size of the tree, but enough. This is a reduction to keep the tree in control, not let it get larger to where it was going to cause problems for the neighbors that didn't like it. Another example which comes from Ryan, and this is a willow tree, and I think most of you, this is Salix alba, weeping willow, and we know that these trees don't have as strong wood as other trees, and they're also more prone to decay. So they're more challenging to work with. And what you can see is that at some point in the time, someone really did do a topping job on this tree. And really the whole canopy is regrowth from that. So you've got regrowth from topping cuts on a tree that has weak wood and poor compartmentalization. It's a bit of a challenge, and a tree that's probably more prone to failure than others. So Ryan went and did one pruning and took out some of the dead and some of the more problematic crossing and interfering. The topping happened 10 years before he got there. And once again, the idea is that we can't correct this. So you can't go back and put the top back on a top tree. But if you care to take the time, you can try to manage it. So Ryan is, he's also a pretty good climber. He didn't use a lift to do this. He got out and did all the pruning by climbing and using tools. And there's what it looked like before his second cut, and there's what it looked like after. So you can see, again, lots of cuts out on the periphery, small cuts bringing things in. And you can see the date at the top of this. It's December 16th, 2013. So he was pruning in the winter, which is probably good. Maybe I'd have to ask Tony if that's phenologically correct for this species. But generally, we like to do that in our part of the world. We have, like others, less pests, less spores. And despite the fact that most people in our country think you can't do anything with trees in the winter, arborists love to get work in the winter because they're sitting around and they don't mind going out there. But in December 2013, we had a massive ice storm. And so this is what it looked like from above. And Toronto sits right there. And so we had, for 2 days, we had this raging ice storm. I don't know if it reached this far as arborists, whether you saw some of the results. But this is kind of this was actually a mild, this looks beautiful, but you can see these piles of branches everywhere, and in some places it was much worse, and I'll show a couple slides of that. But so just by happenstance, Ryan had been doing this pruning on December 16th. December 23rd, the storm came, and on the 30th he went back to look, and this tree, which had been topped and is all epicormic growth, really came through with in flying colors and really didn't lose too much. So, we figured that was quite a good result for a tree that's, relatively fragile. So then another example, and just to show that I don't just talk about this, this is the tree in front of my house. And so I had an even more vested interest in this tree. And this is what I got when I moved in. And unfortunately, several owners before me, an Eastern European fellow, did what I would call a ladder pruning, and got up there with his chainsaw, or maybe his handsaw, or maybe even like we saw from Vivab, maybe just with an axe. But he took the top of the tree off, and the whole canopy again is regrowth from those topping cuts. And as well as that, this is Acer saccharinum, silver maple, also a weak compartmentalizer. So those old topping cuts on my tree are big holes. Now, from Vicky and my perspective, that's not all bad because there's a lot of habitat value from that. And so I have an interest in keeping this tree, A, because it shades my house and gives me urban forest benefits, B, because it's good habitat, and I like seeing the critters that inhabit this tree. So we did the first crown reduction. We did pretty much a retrenchment the first time, just a light pruning over the whole canopy, and then a little more here. My house is down here, so the branches that came over the house, we did some bigger cuts. And this was sort of early days for me, kind of experimenting. Fortunately, the one that I thought was most prone, which was this one, I put a cable in. But I mentioned one of the challenges is dosing. How much is enough? It's tough. So sure enough, I didn't get it right. We learn by our mistakes. But this limb here, you can see, we had a major storm burst in the summertime, and it failed. In fact, I was away, and my son called, and he said, "Dad, you got to come home. I just heard this big bang." And sure enough, my tree on my front lawn failed. A little bit embarrassing. The only redeeming factor for me was that I had made a heading cut on this branch, and the heading cut ended up about 5 centimeters from the front window of my house on the front porch. And all I got was a little bit of a dent in my gutters, but so I was almost there, but not quite. But hopefully to the conservationists among us, I'm not worried about a stub. I left it there, and sure enough, a little bit of growth still came up. There was still some cambial connection, but in the subsequent years, I've had insects there. I've had birds carve out a cavity there. I've had nesting birds in there, and it's not living anymore, but it's providing habitat. So we went back the next time, and there's again a repetitive process. So the next time we did just a bit more. Here's what it looked like about 3 years after the first pruning, and we did get a lot of regrowth because it's a fast, vigorous tree. So we went back and tried to sort some of that out, and because of what happened, we took a little more off the canopy here. And this was also done the summer before the big ice storm, and this is what the tree looks like looking from the roadside. And what I'm happy to see is that slowly but surely, we're starting to see that lower canopy start to appear. And I plan to live at this house for quite some time, and one day I had a landscape architect come and visit my wife to talk about lawn or garden design, and he said, "Why are you keeping that nasty old tree there? You should cut it down." And she conveyed that to me, and I said, no, we're not going to do that. So what I'm hoping is that I can keep the tree and I can keep encouraging this lower crown, And I'm hoping to slowly start to remove some of this because because I have a tomograph, I've been playing around with it on my own tree, and I've been observing that it's definitely very hollow, although it's vigorous and it's putting on some more. But I don't really fancy having another part land on my house and the embarrassment that might go with that. But as I mentioned, this ice storm came along, and these images give actually a more accurate portrayal of what it was like in some of our communities. We just had whole trees collapsing, streets covered. This was just a little north of me. I live close to Lake Ontario, so we had less of a dose of ice on our trees. And thankfully, my tree came through pretty nicely. I had one branch on the ground, one fairly large branch, but it didn't hit the house, didn't hit anything. And you can see, some idea about the ice accumulation here just on a small twig. And if you do that across the whole tree, that sure is a load that the tree didn't plan for. And as I mentioned, I've also, I've been fortunate to travel around to different places, and I'm always looking. So I was speaking at the Australian conference, and I went for a wander around, and I found this tree. And of course, from a distance I saw it, and I had to walk up and take a look. The first thing I noticed was that, it was really doing this lower canopy reiteration. It had already started to grow into itself. But what attracted my eye, let's say, maybe didn't attract me, but was, what was this? What were these big cuts up in there? When I got closer and I got inside the canopy, I saw this. So, a major canopy, and, that explained why we see what we see in terms of the pruning. And, I was thinking, that's pretty good. In a municipal environment, in my experience, when you see a cavity of this size and extent, it often is just straight to the bin, So, but here, they've reduced the canopy. I think they'll probably do some more here. The loading is greatly reduced on this area, and they value the tree. And it's an elm in Australia, so I imagine it probably has some heritage value because it was probably brought from here. So that's another example of this approach. I've been collecting these types of examples from different places. So a colleague of mine, Michael Schlag from Germany, sent me these ones. You can see a pretty drastic and ugly image in front of us of what happens on construction sites. And I know this is not altogether unfamiliar. But Michael said, well, we don't, I guess the community asked him, is there any way we can keep these trees? So, this is the construction site. You can see the extent of the activity and the stress on these trees. So what he did is he decided to do a crown reduction on these trees to try and perhaps balance the shoot to root ratio, to bring the trees down, maybe increase their stability, and that was acceptable. And then a few years later, here's what they look like. They, temporarily, they were reduced for a purpose. And now they're growing back out and seem to be thriving despite what was done around them. So another option where removal was avoided. And I see that I'm getting close to my time. So here's another one from Germany that a friend sent me, a big willow tree beside the beach and rather than, I guess it had experienced a failure. You can see here it's multi-stem at the base. And they went around and did a crown reduction, shortened up the top, shortened the branches, and kept the tree there because on a hot, sunny day, they still want some shade at the beach. And then I think it's one of my last examples, and I was really quite pleased yesterday. Henry, you might recognize this tree. Yesterday, Henry talked about it. It's the Zambique tilia in my native homeland, the Netherlands. And these pictures were sent by, well, this is a Google image, but these pictures were sent by another colleague, and that's the same tree that you saw yesterday. And the interesting thing that Henry mentioned was that there's a young tree growing inside this tree. So in this case, they did some reduction pruning, and here is the original canopy. You can see there's climbers up in the tree here, and that was after the pruning. And the point of this reduction was, first of all, this side here, you can see this big part. That's the original canopy. And one thing is that the new canopy is shading out the old canopy. The other thing is, as Henry mentioned, and I like the way he described it, the young girl is squeezing out her grandmother. And so maybe by reducing the function and the growth of this tree, we might prevent it a little longer from destroying the grandmother. And then quickly, the other side of this is what we shouldn't do. So this is, what we see oftentimes is instead of starting at the top and reducing the tree to make them smaller, they went from the bottom up. And, my eyes found this. You get these long extended branches, lots of sway, and they break. And another example, these were in New Zealand. Here's an oak tree here, and you can see this, or here, and you can see this branch comes all the way out over the path. When you look closely, this is, what I would call the classic klausmatic hazard beam. You could already see the crack happening. And I think this was really a candidate for either a prop or a reduction. And one last example that I saw, outside from the hotel in New Zealand, and you can see in this tree here, here's the map of an old failure that looks pretty much like this. And so they had this failure. It's telling me, don't, do something. And what have they done? They've lion-tailed it and left the whole canopy out there. So what I've heard is that there's quite a resistance in New Zealand to reduction pruning, and I think, it could be not favorable. And again, in another park in Auckland, I did a walkabout. I saw this tree that had failed. I saw this tree had failed. From a conservation arboriculture perspective, that's okay, but this is a highly used public park, and those failures, they were just lucky that they didn't happen with a valuable target underneath it. So reducing leverage, bringing in the canopy to reduce loading. You saw this graphic yesterday from Ed. His name's at the bottom there. We can do this reduction pruning to reduce the load on the ends and reduce the likelihood of failure. And in some cases, we may be replicating this sort of natural limb shedding or the retrenchment process. And so there's another willow. So a couple of last thoughts to try and finish on time. I see the red light flashing at me. You don't see it. Sometimes we need to help old trees get smaller. Sometimes we might want to help them just not get bigger too quickly. And sometimes we need to make big cuts to reduce the risk. But the challenge, of course, is deciding that dose and then following through. And so perhaps through this discussion, you might consider, if you're a contractor working arborist, that when you're approached for a removal, for all the reasons I've talked about, maybe you can apply and sell a reduction instead. One of the good reasons for doing that is that you still have a client when you're done and you can go back. So you save money, save trees, and just remember that it's a progressive and long-term application of these methods instead of a removal or a one-time correction. So thank you very much for your attention under the stress of last night, and I stand between you and your stimulation at the coffee, so thank you very much for your attention.